They say that when you grow old, the world becomes smaller. The streets you've walked all your life start to look different. The faces around you change or disappear, and eventually, if you're not careful, even your own family starts to fade into strangers. I never thought that would happen to me. I raised my son with love, worked myself to the bone to give him a life better than mine, taught him how to be a man, or so I thought. My name is Richard. I'm 74 years old. I spent most of my life in the same town, lived in the same house with my late wife Margaret, God rest her soul. We built a life there, not a rich one, not fancy, but full of honesty, hard work, and decency. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Our son, David, was our only child. He was a bright boy. I remember staying up with him to help with homework after I'd come back from the mill, dog-tired but still proud. I remember teaching him to ride a bike, how his little hands used to grip mine so tightly, how he looked at me like I was the strongest man in the world. I remember thinking that one day, when I grew old and my back gave out and my hands stopped working the way they used to, he'd be there. He'd look out for me, just like I did for him. That's the cruel trick life plays on people like me. The ones who believed that love, by itself, was enough to make someone good. Because love, I've learned, doesn't always pass down like you hope. It doesn't always stick. My wife passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. She fought hard. David and his wife, Olivia, were around for a while during those months, helping with doctor's visits, sometimes bringing food, but they always had excuses. Work was busy, the kids had soccer, Olivia didn't want them to see that kind of suffering. I tried not to hold it against them. People have their own lives. But when Margaret passed and the house became so quiet I could hear the walls settling, I started to feel the weight of age in a way I never had before. The days stretched long and the nights were worse. I couldn't sleep much. Sometimes I'd sit on the back porch with a cup of cold coffee just to hear the wind move through the trees. That's when David started suggesting that I move in with them. At first, I resisted. I didn't want to be a burden. But David insisted. Said there was space in their house, that it was silly for me to be alone now. Dad, come on, we've got the room. And Olivia says it would be good for the kids to spend more time with you. That last part, that was the hook. The thought of being around my grandchildren, of helping with homework again, telling stories, maybe even getting to be someone in their lives. I said yes. I packed up my things. Left behind the house Margaret and I built, said goodbye to my garden, to the old maple tree in the backyard that we planted the day David was born. I thought I was walking into a new season of life. I thought I was walking toward family. The first month at David's place was fine. They cleared out a room in the basement for me. It was finished, had a small window, a single bed, a desk. It wasn't much, but I didn't mind. I told myself I was lucky. Olivia cooked most nights, and I ate upstairs with them. The kids were polite, though always on their phones. David was busy, working long hours, and when he did come home, he was usually too tired to talk much. Still, I helped where I could, washing dishes, folding laundry, fixing the leaky faucet they kept ignoring. I didn't complain. I wanted to be useful. I wanted them to know I was grateful. But slowly, things began to shift. Little things at first. Olivia started leaving me off the dinner text group, so I'd miss meals unless I happened to be upstairs at the right time. One day, I asked if I could cook something special. Margaret's pot roast recipe, and she looked at me like I'd offered to poison the family. "We're trying to eat cleaner," she said. "Less heavy food." I started to notice how often David avoided eye contact. The kids stopped coming downstairs. I heard Olivia telling them not to bother Grandpa when he's in one of his moods. I didn't know I had moods. I thought I was just quiet. One night I came upstairs to find them finishing dinner. The table was full. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, but no extra plate. No seat for me. I stood there for a moment, then turned around and went back down. David came to my room later, said they didn't realize I was home, that it had been a last-minute meal. I nodded. I didn't argue. But something inside me started to shrink. I began keeping food downstairs. Crackers, some soup, a few cans. I didn't want to be in the way. I started eating alone. They stopped asking where I was. It was the 3rd month when it happened. I remember it like it was yesterday. I'd gone 2 days without a real meal. Olivia had started locking the pantry, claiming the kids were sneaking snacks, but I knew better. They didn't want me helping myself. I came upstairs to ask David if I could borrow the car, maybe go pick up groceries for myself. He was sitting on the couch, watching TV. He didn't look up. "Starve or leave," he said flatly. Just like that. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I felt something fall inside me, like a rope snapping. I walked back downstairs, packed the few things I had, and walked out the door. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. It was October. Cold. I had about $200 in my pocket, my coat, and a bag with socks and a toothbrush. I took the bus to a small town I remembered visiting once with Margaret when we were younger. There was a room for rent above an old bakery. Cheap, quiet, the kind of place people forget exists. I paid the first 2 weeks in cash and told the landlord I'd take whatever odd jobs he had. I cleaned gutters, stacked firewood, washed windows. I earned enough to eat and keep the heat on. I didn't tell anyone where I was, not David. Not even I was sure if I wanted to be found. In the evenings, I sat by the window and watched the town settle into darkness. I thought a lot about how things had turned out, not with anger, not even with sadness. Just confusion. How does a man go from building a life, raising a family, giving everything he has, to being told to starve or leave? I tried to tell myself that maybe David was overwhelmed. Maybe Olivia had pushed him. Maybe it wasn't malice, just fatigue. But I couldn't ignore the truth. My own son had decided I was disposable. And the worst part wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the cold. It was knowing I didn't matter anymore, not to the people I had once loved more than life itself. I settled into the quiet life in that little town with the kind of resignation that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion. Each morning I'd wake before sunrise not because I was well rested, but because my body still held the rhythm of a man who'd spent decades rising before dawn to work with his hands. I'd boil water on a creaky stove, make weak instant coffee, and sit by the window as the town came to life slowly, street by street, like someone rubbing their eyes after a long sleep. I didn't speak to many people in those first weeks, not because they were unfriendly, but because I didn't have the energy to start over. I wasn't looking to be known, just to be left alone long enough to remember who I was before the world made me feel like nothing. The room was small, just enough space for a bed, a table, and a chair, but it was mine. I kept it neat, out of habit. Folded clothes, polished boots, dishes rinsed and dried. Some routines stick with you no matter how far you fall. I spent my days doing whatever work came my way. The bakery downstairs needed help lifting flour sacks and stacking wood for the ovens. A nearby mechanic offered cash if I swept out the garage and organized old parts. Once, I spent a whole afternoon shoveling snow off the roof of a church while the priest watched me from the window like I was some ancient penitent paying off sins with labor. I didn't complain. I needed the money, but more than that, I needed the motion. Stillness scared me. It left too much room for thoughts to echo. I kept to myself until one day, a woman named Carol who worked at the post office stopped me on my way to the corner store. She was in her 50s, sharp eyes, hair pulled back tight, with a kindness that she hid beneath sarcasm. She asked if I was the man renting the room above the bakery. I said yes, and she handed me a brown envelope. "Don't get many Richards in this town," she said. "Figured it had to be you." I took it, surprised. I hadn't given my address to anyone. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar, though. It was David's. My heart thudded once, hard, like a door being kicked open. I walked back to my room without stopping and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the envelope. I didn't open it right away. I held it like it was a lit match. Finally, I unfolded the paper inside. It was short, just a few lines. Dad, I don't know where you are, but I've been looking. Olivia said you left because you were unhappy. I don't know what to say. Things have been hard. The kids ask about you. I miss you. Please write back. There was no apology, no explanation, just those awkward, trembling words that didn't fit the man who once told me to starve or leave. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Maybe. Relief? Possibly. Mostly I felt tired. I didn't write back. Not then. Instead, I folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of the nightstand next to the bed. I lay down and stared at the ceiling for hours. Over the next few weeks, more letters came. One every 10 days or so. He told me about how work had dried up, how Olivia had gone back to teaching, and how the kids were growing fast. He didn't mention that night, the things he said, or the way he let me walk out like I didn't matter. But between the lines, I could see it. Regret. The kind a man carries in his chest like a stone. He said he wished I'd call, that he was sorry if I felt unwanted, that Olivia had been going through a tough time and he hadn't handled it right, that he hadn't realized how bad things had gotten. He didn't beg. He didn't demand. But each letter was like a knock on the wall of the cave I'd hidden myself inside. Then one morning, Carol handed me a different kind of envelope. Bigger. Thicker. Inside was another letter from David, but this time there was also a photograph. It was of the house, or what used to be the house. The yard was overgrown, the front porch sagging. A red foreclosure notice taped to the door. The letter was more raw this time. He said they'd lost the house 2 months ago, couldn't keep up with the mortgage, that Olivia had moved out with the kids to her sister's place, that he was staying in a friend's garage, working odd jobs, trying to scrape by, that he'd burned every bridge, but the one he couldn't stop thinking about was the one with me. I deserve everything that's happened, he wrote, but I still miss you. I sat with that letter in my lap, staring at that photograph, wondering how a man could fall so far so fast. And then, with a sudden clarity I didn't expect, I realized that I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt hollow. Watching him fall didn't lift me up. It just made me remember how far we both had sunk. Later that evening, I walked through the town square and sat on a bench across from the old train station. The sky was darkening, the clouds swollen with the promise of rain. I thought about calling him, just once. Not to say much, not to make things right, but just to remind him that someone still remembered his name without flinching. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the letter again, and read the last line over and over. I still miss you. He didn't say, I love you. Maybe he didn't know how anymore. But I miss you was close enough. It meant something. It meant he hadn't buried me completely, even after everything. The next day, I asked Carol if I could send a reply. I kept it simple. Got your letters. I'm still alive. Cold here, but manageable. I'm not angry, just disappointed. Don't know what comes next. But I'm still reading. I didn't sign it with Dad. Just R. I wasn't ready to reopen that door all the way. But I cracked it. That was enough for now. After I sent that first letter back to David, I didn't expect much. Maybe a thank you. Maybe silence. I figured he'd take it as a gesture and then move on with whatever life he was trying to piece together out of the wreckage he had created. But the response came faster than I thought, less than a week later. A small envelope, the kind you don't want to open in public because something about it feels too private, too fragile. His handwriting looked shakier this time, rushed maybe, or just tired. Inside was a note, scribbled in blue ink on lined paper, almost like a schoolboy's journal. He said he was grateful, that my words meant more than I could know, that he'd been carrying the weight of our last conversation for over a year, and hearing from me broke something open. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness, just a chance to talk. In person. Just one time. "Let me look you in the eye like a man," he wrote. "You don't owe me anything, but I need to try." I folded the letter and left it on my nightstand without answering. For 3 days I didn't touch it. But each morning I'd look over at it as if it might change its message while I slept. By the 4th day, I wrote back, "If you want to talk, come find me. I'm not moving again." It was almost 2 weeks before he arrived. I saw him through the bakery window, stepping off the bus with nothing but a duffel bag and a look on his face I couldn't quite name. Shame, fear, maybe something softer buried underneath. I was sweeping the back alley when he walked up. He didn't speak right away. Neither did I. He just nodded, and I nodded back. That was it. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just stood there, 2 men staring at the space between them, filled with everything neither of us could say yet. I offered him the cot in the corner of my room. He accepted without question. That first night we sat in silence. I made tea. He stared out the window. We listened to the wind rattle the glass and let the silence speak for us. The next few days were careful. He helped out where he could, hauling flour, sweeping the bakery floor, repairing the broken hinge on the back gate. The owner, Mr. Nolan, didn't ask questions. He was the kind of man who recognized wounds and didn't poke at them. David kept his head down. He slept hard, like someone who hadn't had real rest in months. Occasionally, he'd offer to pay for groceries or bring me coffee from the diner, as if trying to even the scale between us. I didn't stop him. Letting him contribute gave him dignity, and after everything, I figured that was a good place to start. But the tension never disappeared. It hovered, thin and cold, like a draft you can't quite block. One night after dinner, I finally asked him what really happened back home. Not the polite version, the truth. He rubbed his face, exhaled, and then talked for nearly an hour. He told me about the money problems, how he'd refinanced the house behind Olivia's back to cover a business venture that failed within 6 months, how he lied to her about it, said everything was fine while the bills stacked up like bricks, how she found out one night when a collections officer came to the door, how the fights started and never stopped, how the kids stopped talking to both of them, how the house fell apart, the job disappeared, and eventually Olivia packed up and left. She took the boys and went to live with her sister 3 states over. She didn't even leave a note, just a voicemail. He hadn't seen his kids in 7 months. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. When he was done, he looked at me like he expected a judgment, a lecture, something. But I only said, "You could have told me all this before it got that far." He shook his head. I was ashamed and angry, mostly at myself. But when you live in that kind of shame long enough, you start lashing out at the people closest to you. I didn't know how to stop, so I pushed you out instead. He didn't cry. His voice stayed steady, but I could see the crack in him, deep and worn from years of regret. Over the next weeks, we settled into something that resembled routine. We weren't father and son exactly. Not yet. But we were 2 men trying to exist without destroying each other. That was enough. Until the second wave came. A woman from the county came looking for me, said someone had reported a suspicious male staying in the apartment. Apparently, a neighbor thought David looked unstable and called it in. She asked questions: who he was, how long he'd been there, whether I felt safe. I told her he was my son and that I wasn't going to answer anything else. She didn't press, but her visit left a mark. People talk in small towns. The next day, Mr. Nolan pulled me aside, said a couple of regulars had asked about David, said he wasn't worried but he couldn't afford trouble. I got the message. Keep him quiet. Keep him invisible. David overheard us talking. That night he packed his bag, said he didn't want to cause problems. I told him to sit down. I told him this wasn't going to be like last time, that running wasn't fixing anything, that the only way to stop being seen as a mistake was to stay long enough to become something else. He didn't respond, but he stayed. That week, he got a part-time job at the gas station. Night shifts. Quiet, easy work. He came home smelling like oil and gravel, exhausted but calmer. He started saving money. He bought groceries. He even fixed up an old bike he found in the alley and started riding to work instead of walking. People still looked at him funny, but some nodded now. A few even said hello. Then, one morning, a letter came. From Olivia. No return address, just her handwriting. He opened it at the table. I didn't ask what it said, but I saw his face change. Go blank. Later that day, he told me she wanted to make things formal. Custody papers, no contact, supervised visits if any. Said she was tired of waiting for him to prove anything. Said the kids were better off without the confusion. That night, he didn't come home. I waited until midnight, then walked the streets until I found him sitting behind the church, bottle in hand, not drunk, just holding it. I sat next to him. He didn't look at me. Just said, "What's the point of changing if no one believes you ever will?" I didn't answer, just sat with him until dawn. That was the first time I realized redemption isn't just about doing better. It's about outlasting the version of yourself other people refuse to let go of. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and the world didn't care. The winter came in slow that year, like it wasn't sure it was welcome, and for a while, the cold was gentle, the kind that makes your joints ache but doesn't cut into your bones just yet. David was still with me, still doing the night shifts at the gas station, still bringing home bags of groceries and sitting across from me in silence most nights while the old radiator hissed behind us. We didn't speak about the custody letter again, not directly, but I knew it stayed with him like a bruise under his ribs, the kind you forget about until you breathe too deep. He went through the motions, shaving, fixing things around the building, nodding to the neighbors who didn't know where to place him, but something in his eyes had dulled. It wasn't sadness, not really. It was something more resigned, like a man who'd accepted that the world had already decided who he was, and he no longer had the energy to argue. I tried to pull him back into life in little ways, handing him my old radio to repair, dragging him with me to the local hardware store, suggesting he help the priest fix the church roof come spring, but I could see it wasn't enough. The problem wasn't outside of him anymore. It was inside. He didn't believe in himself, and worse, he didn't believe anyone else ever could. Then, one Saturday afternoon, everything shifted. Not dramatically, but in a way that cracked the ice we'd been walking on for months. The phone rang. I hadn't heard it in so long, I almost didn't recognize the sound. When I picked up, I heard a soft, hesitant voice on the other end. It was my grandson. The younger one. Just 12 years old, but his voice had already started to drop, and he sounded older, uncertain, careful. He asked if David was there. I said yes. He asked if he could talk to him. I held the phone out and watched my son freeze in place like someone had just pulled a ghost out of the wall. He didn't move. I had to tell him twice before he took the phone with both hands like it might shatter. I didn't stay to listen. I stepped outside and stood in the cold with my breath hanging in front of me like a question. 20 minutes passed before he came out, the phone still in his hand, his face pale, his eyes red. Not from crying, just from trying not to. He told me they were coming, just for the weekend. Olivia's sister had agreed to drive them halfway, and the boy said he wanted to see him. Not both boys, just one. But it was enough. The next 2 days were chaos, but the quiet kind. The kind that lives in preparation, in nervous cleaning and rearranging and trying to make things look like something they're not. David scrubbed the floor twice. He bought clean sheets. He even borrowed a book on parenting from the library and read it cover to cover in one night. I didn't tell him how pointless that was. He needed to feel like he could offer something more than regret. When the day came, he stood by the bakery entrance in a coat 2 sizes too thin, pacing, checking the time every 10 minutes. When the car finally pulled up and the boy stepped out, David stopped moving. Didn't breathe, didn't speak. Just watched his son approach, unsure whether to smile, reach out, or fall apart. The boy didn't hug him. He didn't cry. But he didn't turn away either. He looked David in the eye and said, "Hi." And that was the moment I saw it. Something small but unmistakable breaking free inside my son, like a tight knot finally loosening. That weekend, they didn't do much. Walked around the square, bought donuts from the bakery, played cards in the kitchen. It was awkward and quiet and clumsy, but there were moments, small ones, where laughter slipped through, a joke over spilled tea, a smile during a story, a moment when the boy handed David a drawing he'd made, no ceremony, just placed it on the table and walked away. I watched as David picked it up and looked at it like it was a message from a world he thought he'd lost forever. When Sunday came and the car arrived to take the boy back, the goodbye was stiff, but not cold. The boy said, "See you," and David nodded, not trusting his voice. After the car pulled away, he stood on the sidewalk for almost an hour. I didn't bother him. I knew what that silence meant. Later that night, he told me the boy had asked him a question. "Why didn't you try harder?" David didn't answer him. Couldn't, but he promised he would next time. And I think the boy believed him. Not completely, not with trust, but with a kind of curiosity, like he was willing to look again, to see if maybe there was more to the man he'd been told to forget. That night, David sat by the window with his old sketch pad, the one he used to draw in before the world told him to get practical. He didn't draw anything, just flipped through pages. But I saw his fingers stop shaking for the first time in weeks. Something had shifted. The world hadn't forgiven him. His wife still wanted distance. His neighbors still avoided eye contact. But his son had looked him in the eye and said, "Hi." And that small word carried more weight than 1,000 apologies. It was the first real crack of light after a long winter. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to keep him from giving up. After that first visit from his son, something in David shifted. Not all at once and not in the way a movie would have you believe, where a broken man becomes whole after one tender weekend, but in the quiet, halting way that only real people change. He started waking up earlier without my nudging. He began organizing his day in small lists he wrote down in an old notebook I had lying around. He kept the room clean, bought a few secondhand books, cooked meals that didn't always taste good but filled the place with the kind of smells that made it feel like someone lived here again. It wasn't perfect. There were still nights when he didn't speak much, still moments when he'd stare off too long or get a little too quiet when someone mentioned kids or holidays, but I could tell he was fighting for something now. Not just surviving out of guilt or obligation, but actually reaching, even if it was just an inch at a time. The thing is, though, the world doesn't reward quiet efforts. It doesn't applaud a man for folding his regrets or sweeping a floor instead of breaking something. The world, especially small towns like ours, likes a headline, a label, a story it can repeat over coffee. And when people decide what kind of man you are, they rarely go back and check if you've changed the ending. It started with whispers. Nothing new, just more pointed this time. A woman at the grocery store told Carol that someone saw David late at night near the bus stop. Like it meant something. Like maybe he was waiting for trouble or bringing it. Someone else told Mr. Nolan that his customers were uncomfortable knowing that man was around children, which made no sense because he wasn't. But logic isn't what drives fear. It's memory, and in a town like ours, memory stretches long and forgets slowly. Mr. Nolan didn't fire him, but he started giving him fewer shifts. Told him business was slow. I knew better. David didn't say anything. He just accepted it, like he expected things to go that way eventually, like he didn't believe he had the right to ask for better. Then the landlord called, said he'd been asked by someone in the community about who exactly was living in the back room. Said he wasn't looking to cause trouble, but maybe it was time for arrangements to be clarified. I could hear the fear in his voice, the kind of fear that doesn't come from law but from social pressure, from knowing that in a place like this, upsetting the wrong people meant your business dried up fast. I told him David was my son, that he had every right to be here, that I paid rent on time, in cash, and had done so since the day I moved in. He didn't argue, but he didn't promise anything either. A few days later, David received a formal letter from a local legal aid office. Olivia had officially filed for full custody, citing emotional instability and lack of stable residence as the basis. She included claims that he was unfit for visitation until proper psychological assessments and life stability benchmarks could be proven. David read the letter without blinking. Then he placed it on the table and said, it was only a matter of time. He didn't rage, didn't break anything, didn't even raise his voice. That scared me more than if he had. He simply went silent for the rest of the night. I found him the next morning standing in the alley out back in his pajamas, barefoot in the snow, just standing there, like he'd forgotten how cold it was, like he couldn't feel anything anymore. I wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and led him back inside. He didn't resist. He just moved like someone underwater, disconnected, heavy and slow. That week, he stopped going to work, stopped shaving, stopped writing lists. The room grew dim again. Not because the lights didn't work, but because he stopped turning them on. He didn't eat unless I made him. He didn't speak unless I asked a direct question. When I finally asked what he was thinking, he said, I don't know how to prove I'm not the man she thinks I am when every time I get close to something, it slips away. The house, the kids, the job, your trust. Every time I rebuild, someone comes along and knocks it over again, and after a while you start to wonder if maybe they're right to. I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that I'd seen the work he was doing, the change, the effort, but I also knew he needed more than my word now. He needed evidence, something external, something he could point to and say, look, I matter. Then came the fire. It was a Sunday morning. Cold. Windy. I was in town picking up bread when I saw smoke rising from the eastern end near the mechanic's lot. At first, I didn't think much of it, someone burning brush maybe, but the closer I got, the more I could see the panic on people's faces. The old supply shed behind the bakery had caught fire. It was small, but flames licked high into the air and the heat pushed against us like a wall. The firefighters came fast, but not fast enough to stop the smoke from creeping into the bakery itself, not enough to stop the front window from cracking from heat stress. I was standing near Carol when I saw David run toward it. He wasn't supposed to be there. He hadn't left the apartment in days. But now he was sprinting through the smoke, waving his arms, shouting for people to clear the area. I didn't even know what he was doing until I saw him throw open the side door of the bakery and start dragging sacks of flour out of the storage room, one after another, coughing, stumbling, but moving fast. Nolan had forgotten those sacks were in there. If they'd caught flame, the whole place might have gone up. David kept going until the firefighters pushed him back. He collapsed on the sidewalk, coughing, eyes watering, ash on his skin like war paint. They treated him right there. Oxygen, water, checking his lungs. People stared, some in shock, some with something closer to respect. No one spoke, but something had shifted. The next day, Carol told me someone at the town meeting brought his name up, said he might not be what people thought. A small thing. But in a place like this, small shifts matter. Nolan gave him back his shifts, and then some. The landlord apologized. One of the neighbors dropped off cookies. Nothing huge, but enough to show that people had seen something they couldn't unsee. David didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He just went back to work. That night, he said to me, "They didn't cheer. They didn't thank me, but they didn't look through me anymore." I nodded. That was all he'd ever wanted. To be seen again. Not forgiven, not celebrated, just seen. Later that week, a letter came from Olivia. Handwritten. No lawyer this time. She'd heard what happened, heard he'd saved Nolan's business, heard from the boys. She said she was willing to meet. Neutral ground, no pressure, just talk. See who he was now. He read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. Didn't say anything. Just stood at the window that night watching the snow fall under the streetlights. Silent, but solid, like a man who had found his footing again. Not because someone gave it to him, but because he chose to stand up. One more time, when no one thought. He would. The meeting was set for a Saturday, 2 weeks after Olivia's letter arrived, and I could see the storm building in David from the moment we circled the date on the calendar. He tried to hide it, moving through each day as if it were no different from the last, going to work, sweeping the floor, fixing a broken step outside the bakery. But I saw how often he'd check his watch for no reason, how he'd reread her letter in the dark when he thought I was asleep, how he practiced words under his breath like a student before a final exam. I didn't tell him what to say. I didn't tell him what not to say. He needed this to be his, not another version of him trying to meet someone else's expectations. I just made sure he had a clean shirt, enough money in his wallet, and a ride to the cafe where they'd agreed to meet. That morning, he sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat and still, the way a man might hold them just before surgery, knowing that what came next would either save something or prove it was too far gone to mend. He looked at me and said, "If this goes badly, I don't know if I'll come back from it." I nodded. I didn't lie to him. I just said, "Then make sure it doesn't go badly." He almost smiled. Almost. The cafe was quiet when we arrived. Olivia was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window, her hair pulled back like always, wearing that expression she used to get when she didn't want to let you know how nervous she was. I stayed outside. This wasn't my moment. I stood near a bench, hands in my coat pockets, watching through the glass without watching too hard. They talked for nearly an hour. She didn't raise her voice. He didn't drop his. There were no gestures, no tears, no dramatic exits. Just 2 people trying to find some human shape in the rubble of their old life. When it ended, David stepped outside, stood next to me for a long minute, then said, "She's not sure yet." But she didn't say no. I nodded again. Sometimes not hearing no is the biggest yes you can hope for. In the days that followed, he seemed lighter, not like a man who thought he'd won something, but like someone who realized the fight wasn't over, and he still had the strength to keep showing up for it. He started calling the boys, short conversations at first, homework questions, video game chatter, sports scores, but eventually those calls stretched longer, began including bits of memory, fatherly advice, a joke only they would understand. One evening I passed by the door and heard his older son say, "You sound different now, Dad," and David replied, "That's because I'm trying to be." Different, not just sound like it. It stayed with me, that sentence. Honest, uncomplicated, heavy in its simplicity. He began drawing again. It started with a sketch of the cafe window, then the alley behind the bakery, then the boys from memory. Side profiles, hands, shoes, the way they slouched when bored. He didn't show them to anyone at first, just folded them neatly and placed them in a box beneath his bed like something sacred, something that couldn't be rushed into the light. I think drawing gave him a way to speak without defending himself. I think it reminded him he was more than the worst day of his life. Then came the court date, formal custody review. I offered to go with him, to sit in the back, just be a presence. He said no, said he needed to do this alone. He left early that morning, wearing the same shirt from the cafe, holding a folder of documents, notes, letters, photographs, his case, built one piece of effort at a time. When he came back, I was sitting by the stove, waiting, pretending to read the paper. He sat down across from me and said, "It went okay." The judge didn't give me full access, but he didn't shut the door either. Supervised visits, monthly for now. If that goes well, it'll increase. They want consistency, proof I can keep showing up. I looked at him and said, "You've been showing up." They just started noticing. He smiled for real this time. Not wide, not loud, but real. That Sunday, he baked something with the kids when they visited. Burned it, of course, but they laughed and ate it anyway. And I heard the sound of their voices from the hallway and felt something inside me go quiet for the first time in years. Not gone, just settled, like a room after the music stops. One night he asked me why I didn't give up on him. I told him the truth. I had. For a while. After he told me to starve or leave, after he let me disappear like some unwanted guest, I buried my belief in him so deep I thought it might never come back. But when the letters came, when I saw the weight in his words, the cracks in his armor, I realized something. It wasn't my job to keep him whole, but it also wasn't my job to punish him forever. Fathers aren't meant to be judges. We're just men who hold the light steady while our sons learn to walk through the dark. And now, as I sit here, the winter thinning into spring once more, I don't think about how much time we lost. I think about the time we reclaimed. About the quiet mornings when he makes coffee without being asked. About the boys who now call every week, not because they're told to, but because they want to. About the man who once stood in my doorway and said nothing while I packed my life into a bag. And the man who now stands beside me when we fix a leaky pipe or paint a fence, no longer afraid of silence, no longer ashamed of the echo. He may never be who he once was, but maybe that's the point. Maybe none of us are meant to return to who we were. Maybe all we're meant to do is become who we could have been, if only someone had stayed long enough to believe in the second version of us. The days are longer now. Not just in sunlight, though spring has returned in full, filling the trees with a kind of restless green that reminds me of years when I had more strength in my hands and less weight in my chest. It's a different kind of long now, less about hours and more about presence. David still lives here, still occupies the same space in the corner room where I once thought I would grow old alone. But it doesn't feel like sharing anymore. It feels like continuity, like the way life sometimes stitches broken threads back into the fabric without asking whether we think it's too late. The bakery reopened after the fire repairs. Mr. Nolan gave David regular hours again, and now he trains one of the younger boys in town, a wiry kid who barely looks people in the eye, but listens to David in a way I haven't seen in years. Sometimes I watch them through the window, how David explains something with patience, not with the frustrated tone he once used when he was too proud to admit he didn't know how to teach. Now he waits, he listens, he corrects with kindness. There's no audience, no performance. Just a man passing on what he knows and another learning how to receive it. That, to me, is growth. The kind that doesn't make headlines. The kind you feel more than you see. The boys come more often now. At first, it was monthly. Then, every other weekend. Olivia hasn't said much, but she doesn't stand in the way, and I think that's her way of showing that trust is being rebuilt. Slowly, with hesitation, but not hostility. The younger one brings books. The older one helps with little projects, repainting the front steps, tightening screws on the pantry door. They still don't talk much about what happened before, and I don't think they need to. What matters is that their eyes don't lower when they speak to David anymore. They look him straight on, and he doesn't flinch. Sometimes I catch David standing in the doorway of the boys' room after they've fallen asleep, not moving, just watching them with a stillness that says everything. It's not guilt anymore. It's reverence. It's the quiet realization that getting a second chance doesn't mean pretending the first one didn't happen. It means honoring it with something better. As for me, I've started sleeping through the night again. Not always. Some evenings my bones still ache, and the silence still brings ghosts. But mostly, I rest. There's peace in this house now. Not perfection, not absence of pain, but peace. The kind that grows out of endurance, not escape. I don't tell this story because I think it's extraordinary. I tell it because it isn't. Because it happens more often than we'd like to admit. Parents being cast aside, children collapsing under their own mistakes, families breaking not from violence, but from slow, quiet neglect. And sometimes, if life allows it, those same families come back to the table. Not the same, not fixed, but real. People ask me if I've forgiven David. I don't know if that word even fits anymore. What I know is this: he's here. He stays. He tries. And in the end, maybe that's the only apology that matters. Not the words, not the grand gestures, just the presence, the choosing to return, the decision to be better today than yesterday. I don't think I'll ever forget the moment he looked me in the eyes and said nothing while I packed my bag and left his house. But I also won't forget the moment he opened a letter from his son and whispered. He called me Dad. Life gives you both, the fracture and the healing, the silence and the word that breaks it. And in the end, what you carry forward is not who left you behind, but who came back to stay. Sometimes I wonder what Margaret would think if she saw us now. I sit by the window some evenings, tea cooling in my hands, and imagine her standing in the doorway, arms folded, that half-smile on her face, the one that always meant she saw more than I thought she did. I picture her watching David move around the kitchen, wiping the counter, checking on the stew, setting the table without needing to be asked. I think she'd say nothing at first, just tilt her head slightly, eyes narrowed in quiet observation. Then, maybe after watching long enough, she'd say, "Took him long enough." And I'd laugh because she'd be right. She usually was. I miss her more these days, not because I'm sad, but because so much of what's happening now feels like something she was meant to see. Not just David's return, but his transformation. The way he walks differently now, not taller, not prouder, but steadier. There's a kind of grace in a man who's been humbled properly. Not broken, not bitter, just aware. In the months since the boys started visiting regularly, the house has changed, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. It breathes differently now. There's noise again, the good kind. Shoes left by the door, mugs forgotten on the windowsill, laughter trailing in from the hallway. I catch moments I never thought I'd witness again. David playing cards with the younger one while the older one leans against the wall pretending not to care but smiling when he wins. Quiet music in the background. Arguments over the rules. Someone yelling from the kitchen, "You're cheating," followed by, "That's how Grandpa taught me." I don't interfere much. I stay on the edges, not because I feel unwelcome, but because I want this to be theirs. I had my chance to raise David. This is his time now. My role, if I have one, is to be the steady flame in the background, the one that doesn't flicker even when everything else gets dark. We still have bad days. Of course we do. There are mornings David wakes up with shadows under his eyes and a heaviness in his step. Sometimes he doesn't talk much, and I can see the old thoughts pulling at him. Regrets, doubts, the voices that still live in the back of his mind no matter how far he's come. He hides it better now, but I notice. I always notice. And when I do, I don't say much. I just hand him a cup of coffee, sit across from him, and remind him, by doing nothing loud, that I'm still here. That presence, I've learned, is the most powerful form of love when words feel too sharp or too far away. One afternoon, not long ago, we visited Margaret's grave. It had been over a year since David had been there. He stood by the headstone for a long time, hands in his pockets, shoulders drawn in. The boys wandered nearby, respectful but detached, unsure of what to feel or how to behave. I let David have that moment alone. When he finally spoke, it was to her, not me. He said, "I failed. But I'm still here. I don't know if that's enough, but I'm trying." Then he crouched down, placed a small drawing he'd done, one of the house with the front porch light on, and walked away without looking back. I don't think Margaret needed more than that. I know I didn't. Later that week, David asked me if I thought people could ever truly change. I told him it depends on what you mean by change. If you mean becoming someone entirely new, probably not. But if you mean becoming someone honest about who they were, and choosing to be better despite the weight of that history, then yes, I believe in that kind of change. I told him it's not about erasing the past, it's about not repeating it. About building forward with your scars still showing. He nodded, didn't say much, but I could tell it settled into him the way wisdom sometimes does. Slowly, deeply, without applause. He's painting now, not professionally, just as something to do with his hands. Landscapes mostly. Small scenes from around town. The park bench where we first sat in silence after his return. The alley behind the bakery. The train station lit by winter dusk. He gave one to Mr. Nolan, who hung it near the register with a handwritten card that said, "Painted by a friend." That word, friend, meant more to David than I think Nolan even realized. It was the first time someone had called him that in years. I've started a small notebook again, something I used to do when Margaret was alive. Nothing fancy, just notes, thoughts, bits of conversation I don't want to forget. The other day I wrote, "My son peeled potatoes today. He didn't complain, he didn't apologize, he just peeled them, quietly, with purpose. That's what healing looks like sometimes. And I believe that the real proof of redemption isn't in the grand gestures, the apologies shouted into crowded rooms, but in the quiet repetition of good choices. The meal cooked, the floor swept, the child called back, the hand reached for instead of withdrawn. David still carries guilt. I think he always will. That's the price of knowing you hurt someone you once loved. It doesn't disappear just because you've changed, but it softens. It becomes a compass, not a chain, a reminder of where not to step again. And if that's what it takes to make sure the boys grow up with a father who knows how to stay, then maybe the pain wasn't meaningless after all. As for me, I've lived long enough to know that most stories don't end where we expect. We imagine resolutions, clean, clear, cathartic, but real life is messier. What we get instead are moments, little redemptions tucked inside ordinary days. A phone call returned. A coat hung up instead of thrown. A drawing slid across the table with a quiet, "I thought you might like this." Those are the endings we earn. Not the ones we write, but the ones we live. And if someone were to ask me now at this late stage if I think we got a happy ending, I'd probably say no. But I'd say this: we got something better. We got the chance to keep going. To love each other clumsily, imperfectly, consistently. We got time. Not as much as we wanted, but more than we thought we would. And that, I've learned, is enough. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say at the end of a long, hard story isn't, "I won," or "I was right." It's, "I stayed," and we did.